freely available after the event, and we'll send the information to all the registered attendees as well as through social media. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Leslie McIntosh, who is Vice President of Research Integrity and Security at Digital Science. She dedicates her work to improving research, reducing disinformation, and increasing trust in science. As an academic turned entrepreneur, she founded Ripeta in 2017 to improve research quality and integrity. And now it's part of Digital Science, the Ripeta algorithms lead in detecting trust markers of research manuscripts and nefarious networks in science. She works globally to improve research quality, integrity, and security through developing the forensic Scientometrics, never get that right, discipline. She's given hundreds of talks, and her influential ideas on achieving equity and research were highlighted in The Guardian and in Science. It is literally the middle of the night for Leslie, and so we're very grateful for her dedication. So Leslie, I'm going to hand the session over to you.
Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you everyone for having me here. I am going to get started. I just want to make sure that you can see my screen.
Yes, we're all
Yes?
good to see. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the next, I want to take you on a journey about untrustworthy and unquestioned information over the next half hour, leaving time for questions and answers. So what if what happened to journalism happened to science? The mistrust and distrust of science grows due to international tactics and disconnected stakeholders. Those words I penned 3 years ago in early 2022, and 2025 has unfortunately seen some of this come into fruition. But let's talk about journalism for a moment and go back. Journalism got sucked into shifting from reporting facts to entertaining audiences. The media became a horror film slowly destroyed through the gutting of newsrooms and the evolving financial models. The lure of the internet, the chase of the clicks, the viral story, and the information echo chamber would reinforce worldviews regardless of their truth. If one could write, then one could be considered an expert journalist without credentials. And I'm afraid that what happened with journalism, the undermining of a field and the erosion of common ethical standards is and will continue to happen to science. The world has dramatically changed in only a few decades with vaster and faster ways to communicate. Where 20 years ago, we navigated our physical world with paper maps and printed timetables, today we rely on smartphones for both activities. In science, we were bound to the printed journal and physical conferences for discourse. And now, we still rely on those printed materials and in-person meetings for the most trusted information. But as in today, there is a welcome virtual component to help us gather from around the globe. Global science and financial pressures have changed scientists, though, from focusing on a local community with a slow communication cycle to globally, and most notably external to science, discussing and communicating work at a speed uncomfortably fast for most. But the rules of scientific communications have changed, and scientific checks on the reporting of science should as well. In the next few minutes, consider the changes in how science is shared due to the internet and open science. Look at the examples of outside influence into scientific discourse, from confusing conversations to the politicalization of scholarship and science. Then ask yourself if we can continue to act as siloed pillars within the scientific ecosystem and still maintain the trust in science we think we deserve. Scientific knowledge is a pillar of modern existence. It's coalesced more than 2,000 years ago, but in the Library of Alexandria is my example, where knowledge was collected, studied, and discussed by scholars. This knowledge transported us into the future as we know it. Earth, wind, water, and fire were no longer elements, but studied entities that would transform agriculture, transportation, and public health alike. Time and people have a way of harnessing, harvesting, and halting knowledge. Intentional tactics such as political manipulation of the scientific processes and insertion of bad actors into science exist. No one's questioning this in 2025. In 2019, in the name of open science, the EPA, the US Environmental Protection Agency, was charged by the White House with modifying the information they use to make policy decisions, such that most policies needed to be backed by open research data. Now, this on the surface sounds good. However, 2025 has only seen that this has solidified as a Trojan horse for the political undermining of science. But politics has always danced with science. In the Great Library of Alexandria, knowledge may have been collected, studied, and discussed by scholars. Pure it was not, though. The library, or rather the knowledge it held through thousands of scrolls, meant power. Originally intended to show Alexander the Great's dominance, the library had passed through many political hands over the centuries that it had existed. And the library represented the battle for knowledge. In contrast to popular belief, scholars say the building did not disappear quickly in a blazing fire, although there was a fire nearby, but eroded from neglect over time. Can this happen again 2,000 years later? Possibly. Together, the internet, coupled with open science and stretching ethical norms, make it easier for political positions to look like scientific discovery and be seen. Not knowing whom and what to believe eats at the foundation of trust. So no longer confined to the walls of a library, information now flows through anyone with access to the internet. Opening the content of research through open science further pushes society towards democratizing knowledge. But democracy is a form of governance that only works with the understanding and adherence to ethical rules and social norms, and those are being tried. Let me show you how. Let's go on another short journey. I want to literally give you a picture by Johann Barthold Jungkind of the Pont Neuf to think about open science as open water, vast and shared, but not always safe to drink. The very openness that sustains us can also make us very sick, without filters, without curation, without expertise. What I will go through now are some examples of what is happening to science that you may already be aware of. If we are looking at people, we are looking at authors, we are looking at editors, we are looking at peer reviewers. Sometimes they're imposters. By definition, they are not who they say they are. They are a fictitious persona, not based on a known person. We've also seen and also see impersonators. These are the ones that take on the identity of another and use that as their own. We have seen this with people taking on persons who are now deceased, taking on their name and extending their legacy, but also transforming it in a negative way. And then we also see cats. And this one I bring up because there also is, despite what some people in my family think, there are humorous aspects to scholars, and some have put their cats as co-authors on their papers. This is typically meant as a joke, not always, but typically. And I bring this up because they're neither imposters nor impersonators, but there is a level of humor that used to be known in smaller circles, but is not always understood in the global marketplace of knowledge that we now live. There's also unusual networks, and this is one that I want to take you through in a little bit more depth. So let's anchor ourselves first in trust markers. Trust markers are the individual elements that are important to understand, classify, and categorize trust in science. Originally, this was some work that came out of my work with a librarian, Cynthia Hudson Vitale, when we were at Washington University. I was at the School of Medicine. She was at our initial data librarian on the main campus. And we were interested in, how do you make the research that I was working on at the Center for Biomedical Informatics more reproducible? And how do we understand that reproducibility from a paper, from a scholarly paper? So that's where we were looking at, what are those markers of trust that should be in a paper that don't necessarily make it reproducible, but should be there, like the study objective or the hypothesis, if you will, the data availability statement, the code availability. And at that time, we were looking at the reproducibility crisis that came out of primarily psychology and then grew into other areas of research, and predominantly in STEM fields, but not solely. But then as Cynthia and I and colleagues worked a little further, we noticed to really trust the manuscript as the gold standard of communicating research, then other things needed to potentially be in there. And that's what we then called, well, we still do call transparency, the author contribution statement, the ethics statement, the funding statements, things that we look for in a paper, not to say whether the research itself is questionable, good, or not. We want to understand more of the environment in which it was used. So as an example, we have noticed that there aren't a lot of ethics statements in computer science and information science research. Now, they may be doing the exact same research that I would have been doing, my background's in epidemiology and biostatistics, with secondary data. So using data, they could have been doing the exact same thing, but not understanding to go through that ethical approval cycle. So we can start seeing indicators of trust and that need to be worked on. And then we started realizing that we needed to look at what we call authorship, but it's more than authorship. It's the person that is attributed to the scholarship in any component of it. It could be the editor, it could be the peer reviewer. And that we can look at with research history, the manuscript graph, the organization identification. And I know I'm a little bit off on a tangent here, but I promise I'll come back. I just want to make sure that we talk about one thing, and that is a lot of pushback against looking at authorship is or worried that there will be discrimination against underserved or newer researchers or potential researchers in the field. And what I will argue is that and I don't have a study on this, I have anecdotal evidence or anecdotal information from talking with scholars in these research environments, is the ones that are trying to do trustworthy things can't get the attention that they need because they can't compete against those that are gaming the system. And so there is space for this, but there is space for to do this in a trusted fashion. So anchoring this, what I'm about to look at, what I've already showed you with imposters and impersonators, I'm going to show you in a network that I've been looking at, interestingly enough, since the beginning of 2022 and revisited this year for other reasons. So I want to take you on an authorship for sale network that was uncovered. Now, this started back in early 2022, back when Twitter was still around, before it got musky. And this person obviously was very upset because their paper was plagiarized and the other paper was allegedly at that time, although it did come to pass, was being it was being plagiarized, and the citations, so they assumed of their work were going to a different paper. So I thought, well, let's look to see not if I can detect the plagiarism, but if I can look at these trust markers, and this gives us an orthogonal way, a perpendicular way of looking at trust and mistrust within research. And this isn't the exact paper that was plagiarized, because I want to respect the anonymity of the person who posted that. But it is a paper in the group. And a couple of things just stuck out. And neither one of these would say, wow, yes, this is a dodgy paper. You cannot trust it. It's the culmination of a fingerprint of the information that we're looking at that really has started to frame what we can define as untrustworthy to trustworthy in an environment in a forensic way. Again, this is not looking at the research itself. It's looking at the corpus of text. So this one, you look at the authors, and there's 3 emails that are not associated with the institution. But you know what? A lot of people don't use their institutional email. What struck me with this were 2 things. And one is there's 2 pretty much identical emails, one with a dash and one with an underscore, both at Hotmail. Now, why would you use both rather than just one? That was unusual. The other thing is, hotmail.com is an unusual email domain to have if you are a younger researcher. There are plenty of people who still have Hotmail emails who had them when it first came out. So they are more senior researchers at this point, and this person is a younger researcher. So that was just odd. The other thing that really caught my attention on this was it wasn't in the acknowledgments in the paper that I looked in. It was in the funding statement, and it said it was funded by, and this says supported by, the Pharmacon Neuroscience Research Network. Now, in the database that I use, I work at Digital Science, I use Dimensions. In that database, I noticed that there was no link to this funding agency. Now, funding agencies at the time had a grid ID, which is an ID that goes with an organization. Also, they're now known as ROAR, and there's some evolution and all of that. But the idea is that there's an ID like there is an ORCID for a person. This one did not have one. So I contacted the person on our side to say, is this a mistake? Is this perhaps really a funding agency that, didn't, wasn't there? Or perhaps this is a new grant. So I did digging, and I didn't come up with any of this. So when I put it in as a free text in our database, and I'm trying to give you a picture of what it would have looked like before, although I noticed that I kept in 2023, sorry. What you see and what I saw at the time is a rapid growth, a rapid increase in publications. And I thought this was unusual. And in fact, it was very unusual. In fact, out of 123 publications, those had over 6,000 citations for average of 51 citations per publication. There are 361 unique authors and 29 authors without identifiers. That means that they didn't have an ORCID, they didn't have an ID in Dimensions, they didn't have other types of IDs like a Google Scholar. I could not find a research ID for them. And then I also couldn't find an institutional email with them either, right? So these become suspect in, are they truly an author who is contributing as a scholar? I mean, could be possible that they're contributing as an independent person outside, but it just brought up, some concern. I do want to point out, though, 2 of these papers, excuse me, 2 of these papers have over 25 authors on them. They have actually over 100 authors on them. And that brings the total down to 331 unique authors. And I know I'm geeking out on the numbers, but I already warned you my background's in biostatistics. So there you have it. How many organizations are impacted by this? 232 organizations, 212 with identifiers. That means that they are identified as legitimate entities of scholarship, or it could be a funding agency or somewhere in the ecosystem. It could be a teaching university. It doesn't necessarily have to be a research institution, but they do have IDs with geographical coordinates on that. There were 20 organizations, however, without identifiers, and I'm going to get to that. No, I won't show you that in the next slide, but I will say out of those organizations without identifiers, we came to see that some are houses in suburbs. One of them is in the suburb of Sydney, in fact, that purports to be a complete research institution, has research heads, and we cannot find an actual research institution with this. Some were it seemed to be fabricated completely. Some of them were used as just conferences, was their organization, and yet they didn't work for the conference. So you understand, I hope you get the picture that these were really painting a untrustworthy picture. So let me go in and show you about manipulating science through a different type of network. And this is the network of not showing conflicts of interest. Now, this was a very big court case in the United States. This was about a drug called mifepristone, and it was a court case in Texas, which is actually my home state. And it went to a very small court case, and it basically was people coming together saying that this drug was not safe, and they were taking this against, it was them against the FDA. Now, in this court case, I looked at the publications that were used as evidence to discuss mifepristone. Now, you would expect, based on the research, that this is the network of institutes that would have contributed to the scholarship that was presented in the court case. This is a co-citation network, so that one author is citing another author in a paper on between those institutions, right? Here's what we actually saw that was used in that court case. This is not a highly connected network. This is a very, I wouldn't say inclusive, but I'm not coming up with the right word at this point. But it is not an expansive network that seems to be looking at the corpus of literature on mifepristone. In fact, 3 of these papers have now been retracted, but that came with lawsuits against the publishers, and not lawsuits against me, but certainly letters, because I also wrote about this case. So those are some of the nefarious things, the dodgy things that we're seeing in science, not just the authors, but the networks of people that may or may not be within the tent of science, if you will, the tent of scholarship, but who are nonetheless influencing the conversation and the ownership of research that is in our ecosystem, that is also considered their ecosystem now. Things that we need to talk about, things that we need to consider. So on this, I actually want to move back to the principles and go to part 2 of principles. So the first one is, I want to visit the concept of science. Now, I used this term a lot, as you have hopefully gleaned from the very first part of my conversation of this talk. I think of science from a more ancient term. When the Greeks used science, that was a branch of philosophy representing knowledge and inquiry. Science began as a humanistic inquiry into nature, ethics, and meaning. And as Hero just nicely pointed out, which led into what I was going to say here. If we look further back into indigenous cultures, this is ingrained. What we use as science now, that knowledge is ingrained in a culture and in practices of indigenous life. So this has been around for all of humanity. So when I use science in that term as that representing knowledge and inquiry. I also want to talk about expertise, which is an assumption that has been made, and I'm challenging this assumption right now. Because I would say, I've read the book, The Death of Expertise, which I don't agree with, but I understand why he used that. I don't agree with the title necessarily. It's not dead. It's very important. I don't want to get on an airplane without the expertise of the mechanics who've checked it, with the pilots, and of aerodynamics in and of itself, right? And I would say that research begins with an expert or an expert in training. This is addressing the question of who has the right to claim to search for the understanding of knowledge and present it as an expert. And I went back to this because I was challenged when I was looking at those people who put their names on paper who don't seem to have wouldn't be in the tent of science. So I was really challenged with, well, who gets to be here? And at the time I went to US law, basically, because I was in the US at that time. I'm actually in London now. London, England, sorry about that. And a lawyer helps me, and said, well, in US law, a scientific expert, so if you want to go and testify, you must possess the knowledge beyond that of a layperson, and you must be qualified in education, in training, and experience. And the reason that I say this is because this gives us some scaffolding to understand how we should or should not trust what information, what knowledge is presented before us. And I give you this. This is an article that was published, in 2016, talking about preprints. Now, preprints at the time was very much still very controversial. It's not nearly as much anymore, but the assumption here was that the author is a scientist or an expert, when in fact anyone can currently say anything. And we as a scholarly community do not hold the narrative with who and when someone can publish. So we need to understand, are we willing to define that? Are we willing to put that scaffolding of trust? So the other thing that I want to point out is a little bit of deception. And part of this is in the terms that are being used and throwing around. And I hope you have not heard the word fraud yet, until now, in my talk, because a lot of people talk about the nefarious things, the dodgy things that are going on in science as fraud, but they're not. Okay, these are not activities that are in violation of the laws of the state. There is no crime for the most part. They may be awful, but right now they are lawful, and we need to get a hold of that. So, what are the motivations? I want to take us beyond the individual gains, the perverse incentives. They're there. Okay, don't get me wrong, and I'm not arguing that. But we have to also think about the ideological promotion that institutions, that people will go through in order to get what they want, and by sacrificing the trust and the truth that we look for in scholarship. The other thing and the other reason is geopolitical influence. Now, I started talking about this 3 years, and people thought I was a little bit crazy, which, I know this is being recorded, so, you can still argue that, but that's clear that that's happening. What do we have to lose, right? There are securities and risks to individuals, to institutions, to publishers, to governments. And I would say the biggest one right now is to knowledge itself. But there are pathways that we can go on to put this scaffolding of trust around open science and this scholarship that we so hold dear. And this is where I do want to take back to art and actually what is fraud. If we take a painting, an oil painting, and we want to authenticate it, so something that was painted purportedly by someone like this one, which was attributed to Goya, but was actually by Lucas Velasquez. The way that's done is looking at the provenance, the properties of it, and then the professionals. Then they move to professionals. I argue that for scholarship authentication, we can do the same. We can look at the provenance, the properties, and then have professionals to help us. What is the provenance of the research? That's where we need to look at the authorship, the individuals, the institutions. What's the transparency? We've already talked about this. This is difficult to fabricate if done right and checked. Then there are properties are the properties of this research genuine? The methods, the data code availability, the images, the data. This is at risk of AI, right? Is the form of work consistent with the discipline, the phrase analysis, the plagiarism? This is also at risk for AI. This is where, though, professionals come in. We want to look at the context. Does the provenance over time create a believable narrative? This is where professionals such as some of you who are attending this today who can come in and understand. But we need forensics around this open science and a trusted science. And that is why, as mentioned earlier, I did help found Forensic Scientometrics. You can look at FoSci at substack.com. There's also an article on the emerging discipline to protect the scholarly record, where we bring different stakeholders together across the ecosystem. So everyone can say that it may not be their fault, but it is our responsibility in order to protect and trust our science. So I want to leave you with some intertwined thoughts. And this comes back to what I said in the abstract. We live in an era where information is more open than ever before. Yet in breaking down barriers to communication, we have too often neglected to build the scaffolding of trust that sustains a healthy research ecosystem. Without expert curation, accountability, and transparency, openness can devolve into an untrusted and increasingly manipulated knowledge swamp. This talk explored three really intertwined thoughts: that science has always danced with politics, and pretending otherwise only weakens our understanding of its role in society. That opening science without reinforcing its trust structures leaves both researchers and the public vulnerable. And finally, we must ask, what do we want from science? Not just what is happening around us to dictate what and how science is used. And by reflecting on these tensions, I argue that libraries, research, and the public alike have a shared responsibility to engage more actively with the trustworthiness of information. Because the goal of science is not and never has been certainty, but resilience in navigating a world of contested truths. May we garner the resilience we need for the new world that we live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie, for that fantastic and stimulating presentation. So today's event is about discovery in an open and artificially intelligent world. And we've decided to consider this question throughout the day within three contexts. So first being trust, which is what we're discussing now, influence, and then finally discovery. So your talk was addressing the issue of trust in knowledge, and specifically in scholarly knowledge, and the risks that are associated with the reduction of trust due to an erosion of a shared understanding of that knowledge. So not surprisingly, there's been some discussion and questions as you've been talking. So the first one I'm going to refer to is a comment that touches probably more on the why rather than the what. and they mention that the authors being referred to are from the Global South. The Global North has dominated the publication world and industry for decades. So papers from non-English native speakers get rejected at a huge rate. So plagiarism is only a byproduct of this systemic problem. So I think that's talking
So,
to the system and particularly the reward system in our environment, academic environment, which is the root cause of quite a few of the issues that we deal with. But how have you found that those observations that you're making about the sort of distribution of these kinds of activities?
yeah, here's what I would say on that is I have yet to see one country in the global north or global south that conducts research that doesn't have some sort of scam going on. I think they vary by place. If you come to London, England, make sure that your bicycle is definitely locked and your phone is stowed away, right? Because those are the scams that happen. I'm talking about in public, obviously. That's not what happens in different places. Um, I think that there's a couple of things that are happening when it comes up with the global south. So yeah, those names might have been, but out of those 40 countries, I can tell you 12 of them were in, I call them Eurovision countries because Europe is an interesting thing. And we're considering Australia part of that, right? So it's not just affecting the that type of scam, the paper mills, contract cheating, which I didn't even get to, is definitely affecting everywhere. So that happens. I think the other thing, and I'm not disputing that papers that are more poorly written because of lack of English language ability, poorly written from a grammatical standpoint, not from a scientific, from a research standpoint, are rejected at a higher rate. I'm not debating that. That has been shown to be true. What I would say is the good that's coming out of the global south is also not highlighted. Ethiopia has the highest rate of putting data availability statements on their papers. The other top 10 countries come from 10 out of the top 20 come from sub-Saharan Africa. How many times do we hear that? Those narratives don't get shared as much. So there's a lot of good going on there. And I think I might have missed one other point, Danny. So if I did,
Talking about the systemic problems in our and inequities, I think in the reward system really was what's sort of inherent, and that's a very big it's a whole symposium in it.
yeah, yeah, it is. And I will tell you, one of the persons that I work with in India, Achal Agrawal, he always points out that there the incentive is that you get paid by paper. And and so it is an incentive to just get a paper published so that you can get paid. I would argue that I got paid for publication when I was at the Washington University because that's how you get promoted. It's a different cadence, though, a different rhythm, but there are perverse incentives everywhere, unfortunately, and those have to be addressed. And yes, it's a whole symposium in and of itself.
Yeah, I find, and we're talking about openness and artificial intelligence. I find the conversations about research integrity quite often talk about the integrity of the researcher, whereas we really should be talking about the integrity of the
Mm,
research. And it's
yes.
not about bad actors, it's about a bad system. And if we have an open system, a system where people are providing their protocols prior to even conducting the experiments, where people are providing the data that supports the claims that they're making, etc., the opportunity for bad acting is reduced considerably. So the openness of our research processes is something we can do, which kind of inherently improves research integrity just by the nature of the taking out the actor aspect of the equation. Okay, so I think you've addressed this question in your talk, but it was one that asks why the US law's interpretation of science is being referred to here.
Let me, yeah, I don't actually think I clarified that. I needed to go off of something when I was looking for what is a scientist? How do
Yeah.
we define that? So I looked at US law, and then I started looking at European law and different countries within Europe and Australia, and found that because there was a court case in the US, it was the most well-defined that I could understand, but it didn't differ all that much. But it does differ by different countries, but it was a starting place to have a discussion over who has the right for us to have them as a name to be providing that knowledge, right? That we should trust or not trust. Where is that level? It was a starting place, so that's where I started.
Yes, it's quite interesting, isn't it? In this kind of area, there's a lot of language and words where we sort of assume that we know what they mean, and actually, when you start digging down into the provenance or for a definition, it's not there. It's understood, but what does that mean these days? There's a comment here about, I see that you mentioned AI is putting trust in genuine provenance at risk. And so the question, and this might be something less for you and more for the panels, but the question is, how can we distinguish different uses of generative AI, like use of multimodal models to visualize real data versus using an LLM to fabricate data? I feel like that may be
This is
slightly up
where,
your...
well, but this is actually what I was trying to say on finding that network, right? I think we have to look at this, come at it orthogonally to look at this question. To your point, when you were talking about open science, I completely agree that the more transparent we are within the tent of science, if you will, then the easier it is to understand whether we can trust or not trust. So what, honestly, if someone used a translation service for the writing, if they weren't strong on the English, if that's what they were publishing in. I've reviewed articles where the science is great, the research is great, the English wasn't. That could be fixed. But they had their data, they had their code, they had the information where I could trust it. Where I would argue that we really need to look at the scaffolding of trust and what that means with open science is outside this tent of science. What is the narrative that we want? And sorry, that I know that gets to another question, but back to Gen AI and LLMs, I think we need to be careful about focusing so much on is it or is it not, rather than how do we trust the system of science, that ecosystem that we're working in.
Yeah, yeah. And a final question, which is amazing talk, Leslie. What are your thoughts on the conflict between the perceived fairness of blinded peer review versus the need for transparency?
Oh, that's a tough one. If it weren't for transparent peer review, I wouldn't have been able to find the conflicts of interest that were present in the mifepristone case. Um, I think that I think that there's good arguments. I think there's discrimination against people based on their name, based on their gender, based on other things when it's not blinded. I think the important part is that somewhere it is unblinded and there needs to be checks by somebody on things like conflicts of interest, on ensuring that those measures of trust and those trust markers are there regardless of the peer review being blind or transparent. They're unblinded to somebody, and that needs to be checked.
And I think we're starting to talk about openness again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie, for staying up so late and being coherent and keeping us, stimulating our thoughts around these questions of trust. They're very big concepts for us to get our heads around. You've
Yeah.
shown examples of what kind of has triggered your bigger thinking. So the focus is not so much on the examples per se, but more on what do these examples kind of exemplify, and what kind of futures does
Yeah.
this sort of demonstrate? And it really points to the work of forensic scientometrics. There you go, got it right. And
Yeah.
and there's a growing community of your colleagues around the world who are coming at this whole question from lots of different perspectives. But it's really nice to see that things are starting to sort of form around that at a time where it's becoming more important from a geopolitical situation and also from a technological perspective as well, for us to start putting into place these kinds of raising awareness to start, but then putting in place these kind of mechanisms to try and address them. So Can I say thank you once again? It's time for you probably to go to bed and have a lovely big sleep. We're going to continue on here.
And I wish I could stay, but yes, I am going to go on and go to sleep at this
but
point. So
we'll
thank you
send you the
so
recordings.
much. Thank
So
you
thank
so
you,
much.
Leslie. Thank
All
you.
right. Have a good day.
So that's brought us to the end of our first session for today. We're going to break for morning tea now for 15 minutes. We'll leave the Zoom link open. We'll just put a slide up with some music behind it. So we suggest you go off and get yourself a cup of tea. Join us back here at 10:45 for the first panel session. Remember, you can add your comments to the shared documents. Thank you for those who are already doing so. We'll put the link back into the chat again for those people who joined after the last time we put it in. And we're going to take a 15-minute break for morning tea. See you at 10:45 Australian Eastern Daylight Time for the first panel session.